It had been years since the war ended. The war between vampires and humans that left entire cities in ruins, their once thriving streets stained with the blood of the fallen. The peace that followed was a delicate thing, one carefully brokered by both sides. Vampires and humans lived under a set of strict rules, binding agreements forged out of necessity. Vampires, bound to the shadows, were given their territories in the dark corners of the city. Humans, in turn, were promised protection, but only if they adhered to the agreement. No one truly believed that peace would last forever. The rules were clear. No one crossed into the other's territory without permission, and no one, under any circumstance, was allowed to kill outside of their designated zones. It was an uneasy truce, fragile and tenuous, but it held, until one man, one vampire, decided to break the rules. Victor had always been different from the rest. Where others followed the rules to ensure their survival, Victor reveled in chaos. He believed that the truce was a lie, a temporary illusion. It was weakness, he claimed. His eyes were set on power. He saw the peace as an opportunity, not a resolution. He wasn't content to live in the shadows. He wanted to rule. Jay Perez, a man born into the world of vampire hunters, knew this all too well. Jay had grown up watching his father, a seasoned hunter, take down vampires who crossed the line. Jay himself had never been a typical member of the hunting community. His family was still alive, the death of his father a scar that could never heal. His younger brother, Benny, had no idea what they were truly dealing with. Benny, on the other hand, lived an entirely different life. He was a beat maker, a creative soul who spent his days crafting sounds and mixing melodies in his small bedroom. He was a simple man, kind-hearted and naive, often lost in the world of music and his love for skateboarding. He lived with their grandmother, a kind and nurturing figure who had been a rock in their lives since their parents died. It wasn't until the night that Benny was asked to drive for Jay that his life took a dark turn. Benny didn't know why he agreed to substitute for his brother that night. He had no idea what he was walking into. All he knew was that Jay had an important assignment to complete, and Benny, eager to make some extra money, stepped up. He'd driven Jay's black Cadillac Escalade before, but never in a situation like this. The clients were rich, influential people, and Benny, despite his nervousness, was determined to do a good job. When he picked up the two women, his unease started to grow. Blair was beautiful, with long, fiery red hair and a smile that seemed to have a secret of its own. Zoe was more aloof, her eyes cold and calculating, a predator's gaze. Both women were stunning, but they carried an air of mystery about them that made Benny question everything. They were just supposed to be his clients for the night, nothing more, but they weren't. As they slid into the back seat, Blair wasted no time in striking up a conversation. She asked Benny questions about himself, trying to break the ice. Benny, awkward and unsure, answered her hesitantly. He felt the pull of her charm, but his mind couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then Zoe spoke. Her voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "What would you do," she asked, "if you knew tonight would be your last night alive?" Benny laughed nervously, trying to play along. He wasn't prepared for the question, but Zoe wasn't joking. Her eyes bored into him, unblinking. Blair leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for his response. "I don't know," Benny said, trying to keep it light. "I guess I just hang out with my brother, or maybe, I don't know, eat a pizza?" Zoe's lips curled into a faint, almost predatory smile. "So you wouldn't do anything spectacular?" "No," Benny replied, a bit uncomfortable, but trying to mask it with humor. Blair raised an eyebrow, then leaned in closer. "What about your grandmother?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. Benny's heart skipped a beat. The mention of his grandmother, the one person who had kept him grounded, the only family he had left, struck a nerve. He glanced at Zoe in confusion. "Who would you kill? Your grandmother? Or someone else? What about us?" Benny froze. What was happening? The playful game had turned dark. I don't think I'd kill anyone," Benny stammered, his face reddening. "Maybe, I'd just kill you. He pointed at Zoe in jest, trying to laugh it off, but neither of the women laughed. The air in the car grew heavy. Zoe's eyes darkened. She leaned back into her seat, looking at Benny with a strange, predatory glint in her eyes. The atmosphere in the car became increasingly tense as the night wore on. Benny tried to keep things light, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't long before the trio arrived at their first destination, a high-class masquerade party. Benny had never seen anything like it: masks, velvet, chandeliers, and laughter that seemed hollow. Before they entered, the women showed him an amulet, a red stone that glowed faintly in the dim light. "You can't enter without one of these," Blair said with a sly smile, handing Benny the amulet. Benny, still trying to make sense of everything, didn't question it. As the night continued, Benny's unease deepened. He started noticing strange things. Messages on Zoe's phone from someone named Victor. A blood-stained bag in the back of the car. An officer who seemed oddly familiar. And then he saw it. The vampire hunters. The pieces started falling into place, and Benny was beginning to understand that he wasn't just driving for two rich women. He was caught in the middle of a war. A war that his brother, Jay, was trying to prevent. But how could Benny help when he didn't even know who the enemy was? Suddenly, Benny's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Jay. "Stay away from the women. Trust no one." Before Benny could respond, the car window shattered. A figure emerged from the shadows, someone he had hoped never to encounter. Victor. Benny's heart pounded in his chest as Victor approached the car. The shattered glass from the window seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. He had come into this night expecting nothing more than a simple, albeit awkward, driving job for his brother. But now, everything had changed. He was no longer just a bystander. The world of vampires, of blood and death had collided with his own in ways he couldn't have imagined. Victor's cold eyes locked onto Benny's, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. The vampire didn't look particularly menacing at first glance. He was well-dressed, his tailored suit giving off an air of sophistication that contradicted the darkness in his gaze. But there was something in the way he moved, in the stillness of his posture, that made Benny's skin crawl. "You must be Benny," Victor said, his voice smooth, almost gentle, as if he were introducing himself at a dinner party rather than confronting a potential threat. Benny's hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but he hesitated. Something about the way Victor spoke made it clear that running was not an option. The vampire didn't even seem concerned with Benny's apparent fear. He was too calm, too composed. "Get out of the car," Victor said, his tone suddenly sharp. "You're coming with me." Benny didn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of this nightmare, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He glanced around quickly, hoping for some kind of escape. But there was nothing. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only other sign of life was the faint glow of the street lamps, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like fingers reaching from the darkness. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Victor continued, his eyes narrowing. "I'd prefer not to hurt you, Benny, but I will if I must." That was all it took. Benny's heart quickened, and his mind screamed for him to move. He reached for the door again, but before he could open it, Victor's hand shot out, fast as lightning, grabbing him by the wrist with an iron grip. Benny gasped. The coldness of Victor's touch sent a shiver up his spine. His vision blurred for a moment as his heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Victor's gaze was unwavering, and in that moment, Benny realized just how much danger he was in. He wasn't just dealing with a vampire. He was dealing with someone who had crossed the line. Someone who was prepared to burn everything to the ground. "You're not going anywhere," Victor said, his voice a low growl now.
"Until you do what I say." Benny's breath hitched in his throat. He didn't know what Victor wanted, but it couldn't be good. Panic surged through him, and he did the only thing he could think of. He swung his elbow back, catching Victor in the ribs. The vampire grunted in surprise, but his grip on Benny didn't falter. In fact, he seemed almost amused. Victor's lips curled into a smile, one that was more chilling than comforting. "Brave, but pointless," Victor remarked, his grip tightening. Benny was desperate now. His mind raced through the possibilities, each more hopeless than the last. What was Victor going to do? Was he going to kill him? Was he going to take him somewhere, do something terrible? His thoughts were interrupted when the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. Blair. Blair appeared from the shadows, her red hair gleaming under the streetlights. She moved toward them, her eyes flicking between Benny and Victor, the air thick with unspoken tension. There was something in her expression, a mix of regret and something darker, that made Benny's stomach twist. "Victor?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let him go." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her sudden intervention. He released his grip from Benny's wrist, letting him stumble backward. Benny winced, rubbing the sore spot where Victor's fingers had dug into his skin. He glanced at Blair, his heart still racing. What was going on? Why had she stepped in? "He's not worth it," Blair continued, her eyes not leaving Victor's face. "We're not here to make a scene." Victor, who had been poised to lash out again, seemed to reconsider. His smile on his face never wavered, but his eyes grew colder. "I don't need your permission, Blair," Victor muttered. "This is bigger than you think." Blair stepped closer to Benny, her eyes softening just slightly as she looked at him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Benny didn't know how to answer. How could he be okay after everything that had just happened? He nodded, though, swallowing his fear. "I think so. He stopped himself, not sure how to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Blair's expression softened further, but there was a darkness to her that Benny hadn't noticed before. Something about her had changed since the first time they'd met, and Benny couldn't quite put his finger on it. But as she looked at him, there was an undeniable pull between them, an invisible thread that seemed to bind them together. "You're in danger, Benny," she said, steady. "Victor doesn't play by the rules. He never has." Victor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the two of them. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret crossing me." Blair didn't flinch. She didn't look afraid, even with Victor so close. She stood tall, unwavering, as if she were unafraid of the vampire lord before her. "You're the one who will regret this, Victor," Blair said quietly. "You've crossed the line. You're starting a war." Victor smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "A war? A war has already begun, my dear. You're just too blind to see it." Before Benny could respond, before he could even process what was happening, Victor turned on his heel and disappeared into the night, his footsteps fading into the distance. Blair watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned back to Benny, her eyes softening again. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to get involved." But Benny didn't feel comforted. He felt more confused than ever. What was going on? Who was Victor, and why was he so determined to drag Benny into this nightmare? Blair seemed to sense his unease. "Come with me," she said, her voice almost pleading. "You need to understand what's really happening, what's at stake." Benny hesitated, looking around. He didn't want to trust her. He didn't want to be part of this world that had suddenly exploded into his life. But something in Blair's eyes made him feel as if there was no other choice. No matter what happened next, he was already in too deep. With a final glance down the darkened street, Benny followed Blair, not knowing that this was only the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront the darkest parts of himself and the world around him.
Benny's mind was reeling, too many questions buzzing like an angry swarm of bees in his head. He had only just begun to grasp the gravity of his situation, and it was becoming clearer with every passing minute that the world he thought he knew was nothing more than a fragile facade, one that could collapse at any moment. Blair led him through the quiet streets, her pace swift and purposeful. Benny had no idea where they were going, but he couldn't afford to ask too many questions, at least not yet. His heart was still pounding, his body still trembling from the near encounter with Victor. He was alive, yes, but how long would that last? And why had Victor spared him? What did he want with him? "Where are we going?" Benny finally asked, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and curiosity. Blair didn't look back, her gaze fixed ahead. "To a safe place. You need to understand what's happening, Benny. There's no turning back now." Benny swallowed hard. Safe place? The more she spoke, the less safe he felt. Nothing about the night felt safe. But if Blair was the only one offering him a semblance of protection, he had no choice but to follow. The two of them made their way into a narrow alley, the concrete walls closing in on them like an ever-tightening noose. Blair didn't hesitate. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural. Benny, still fumbling with his thoughts, couldn't help but notice the strange energy radiating off her, a quiet strength he hadn't seen before. She wasn't the same person who had gotten into the car with him hours ago. Something had shifted in her, something darker, something far more dangerous. They arrived at an old, dilapidated building that looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. Blair knocked 3 times on the steel door with a rhythm that seemed practiced. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face. His eyes were wary, but they softened when he saw Blair. "Blair," he said, his voice low. "You brought him?" She nodded. "He's not a threat. At least not yet." Aaron eyed Benny skeptically before stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in then, but you're not staying long." The inside of the building was a stark contrast to the crumbling exterior. It was clean, almost sterile, with a small makeshift kitchen off to the side and a few worn couches scattered around the room. The place had an air of quiet desperation, as if it were a temporary refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. Benny hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. He didn't trust these people. Hell, he didn't even trust Blair fully, despite the strange connection he felt to her. But he was out of options. If he didn't want to end up dead or worse, he needed to understand what was going on. And Blair, for all her mystery, was the only one who seemed to have the answers. "Sit," Blair said, gesturing to one of the couches. "You'll be more comfortable here than out there. I'll explain everything." Benny sat down, his legs heavy beneath him. The tension in the room was palpable. Aaron disappeared into the back, leaving Benny alone with Blair. As she sat down across from him, Benny took a deep breath. "Okay," he said, his voice unsteady. "Start talking. What the hell is going on? Why was Victor after me? Why didn't you just let him take me?" Blair's expression softened slightly, though there was still a coldness to her gaze. "Victor's plans go beyond just you. He's trying to start a war, and you're caught in the middle of it." Benny frowned. "A war? What are you talking about? I'm just a guy. I don't even know what's happening." Blair took a slow breath. "Victor isn't just any vampire. He's a rogue, a renegade. He doesn't care about the rules that have kept our world from falling apart. He wants to take control of the city, all of it, and he's willing to do anything to get it. But he can't do it alone." Benny sat up straighter, the weight of her words sinking in. "So you're saying I'm part of his plan?" Blair didn't answer immediately. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the red amulet Benny had seen earlier, the one that was in Zoe's possession. It gleamed faintly in the low light of the room. "This," Blair said, holding it out to Benny, "is the key to everything." Benny's mind raced as he took the amulet from her. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive. "What do you mean? What does this have to do with me?" Blair's eyes softened slightly, though she still had a coldness to her gaze. "You're not just some random guy, Benny. You're the son of someone important, someone who helped maintain the fragile peace between humans and vampires.
Your father was one of the original peacekeepers, the ones who created the truce. And now, Victor wants to tear it all down. Benny recoiled. My father? What do you mean? I don't even remember him. Blair nodded, her gaze growing distant. You were too young when he died, but the legacy he left behind is what Victor wants. And now that you're here, you're a target. A chill ran through Benny's veins as the pieces began to fall into place. His father had been part of the peacekeeping agreement, a man who had worked to ensure the truce between vampires and humans held. And now, it seemed, the truce was in jeopardy, and he, Benny, was caught in the crossfire. So what do I do now? Benny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell do you want from me? Blair's expression softened further. I'm not asking you to fight Victor, Benny, but I need you to help us. We need to stop him before it's too late. Stop him? Benny echoed. How? I don't even know where to start. Blair leaned forward, her voice low and serious. You already know more than you think. Victor will come for you again, and when he does, we'll be ready. But there's something else you need to know. Benny's pulse quickened. What? Blair's eyes locked onto his. You're not completely human anymore. Benny's breath hitched. What do you mean? Blair held up her hand, revealing a deep scar on her wrist. I was once like you, human, innocent. But when Victor turned me, I became something else, something more. You've already been marked, Benny. There's no going back. You're part of this world now, whether you like it or not. Benny's world tilted on its axis. The words hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating him. What are you saying? He asked, his voice trembling. Are you telling me I'm going to become like you? Blair didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked toward the small kitchen area. She opened a cabinet and pulled out a small vial of blood. She held it up to the light, letting it catch in the dim glow of the room. I'm saying that you're already part of it, Blair said softly, her back to him. You've been marked, Benny. And when the time comes, you'll have to choose a side. Human or vampire. Benny's heart thundered in his chest as the gravity of her words sunk in. He was caught in a world he didn't belong to, and his choices would determine everything. The peace between humans and vampires was unraveling, and Benny was the unwitting key.
The quiet of the abandoned building felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on Benny. He could hear his heart thudding in his chest, each beat reverberating like a drum. The weight of Blair's words pressed heavily on him. You've been marked. He had no idea what that meant. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, tell himself it was just Blair's way of keeping him tied to this war, this chaotic world of vampires and humans, a world he never wanted to be a part of. But deep down, he knew she wasn't lying. The amulet he had touched felt alive, like a pulse under his fingers. Something had shifted inside him, something subtle but unmistakable. He stared at Blair, still processing the enormity of everything she had just told him. She was looking out of the window now, her back to him. He could sense that she wasn't just a victim in all of this. She had lived through it, survived it. But was it survival or something else? What happens now? Benny asked, his voice hoarse. How do I stop this? How do I stop him? Blair turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was a deep sadness in them, an understanding of something Benny wasn't yet prepared to face. You can't stop it, Benny. Not completely. But you can fight. You have to. Benny shook his head. Fight who? Victor? But I'm not a part of this world. I don't know anything about fighting vampires or whatever this is. He gestured vaguely at himself, still feeling like a man lost in a nightmare. Blair's gaze softened, and for a moment, she almost seemed human. I know, she said quietly. I know it's hard to accept, but you're already deeper into it than you realize. You can't just walk away. I don't want to be part of this, Benny whispered, feeling a lump form in his throat. This isn't me. I don't know anything about vampires or wars. I just want to go home.
Blair's eyes darkened, and she stepped closer to him, her voice firm but tinged with empathy. "You don't get to go home, Benny. Not anymore. There are no more homes for people like us." She paused, then added, "Victor will come for you, and when he does, you'll be forced to choose. Don't fool yourself into thinking you can walk away. People like you and me, we're the ones they target. You're already marked by the old world, and that's why they'll keep coming after you. They'll never stop." Benny's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, wanted to scream at Blair for dragging him into this nightmare. But deep down, he knew she was right. There was no turning back now. Whatever Victor had planned, Benny was already caught in its wake. And the longer he resisted, the more danger he put himself and those he loved in. Blair seemed to sense his internal struggle. Her voice softened. "Victor has made his move. He wants to destroy everything your father helped build. That's why we need you, because your bloodline is more important than you know. You're not just a human in the wrong place. You're the key to everything." "I don't understand," Benny muttered, his mind spinning. "Why me? Why my family?" Blair's expression grew distant, and for a brief moment, Benny saw something in her eyes, a shadow of her former self. "Because your father didn't just fight vampires. He fought for something more. He was one of the last of the peacekeepers, the ones who held both sides together. His work gave us a chance to survive, a chance at peace, and Victor wants to destroy that." Benny swallowed hard. His father was part of something important, something monumental, but his death had left Benny with nothing but a legacy of violence and broken promises. And now the very people his father had worked to protect were coming for him. Blair's eyes narrowed. "You have to come with us, Benny. We need your help to stop Victor before he burns everything down. We can't do it alone." Benny's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. One part of him was screaming to escape, to run far away from all of this. But another part, the part that still felt a strange pull towards Blair, the part that wanted to be something more than the scared, helpless guy he had always been, couldn't ignore the sense of duty that had begun to creep into his chest. What if he could stop Victor? What if he could help prevent the bloodshed, the chaos? What if his father's legacy wasn't just a forgotten dream? He took a slow breath, meeting Blair's gaze. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll help, but I need to know everything. I need to know what you and your people are really planning." Blair's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "Good. We don't have much time. Victor's next move will be dangerous. We need to be ready." That night, Benny couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in the makeshift bed Blair had set up for him, his thoughts spinning. He kept seeing Victor's cold eyes, the smirk on his face, the quiet, dangerous aura he exuded. That vampire was far more than just a rogue who wanted to break the rules. He was a force of nature, and Benny had the terrible feeling that he wasn't going to stop until he had destroyed everything. Blair's words echoed in his mind. "You're the key to everything." What did that mean? How could Benny, a kid who barely understood what was happening, be the key to stopping a vampire like Victor? He sat up in bed and rubbed his face, trying to make sense of it all. His life had been simple once. Music, skating, hanging out with his grandmother. Now everything felt like a whirlwind, spinning out of control. Was this his fate? To become a part of this vampire war? Suddenly he heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Benny called, unsure of who it was. He wasn't used to people showing up at his door, let alone the strange group of vampires and hunters that had taken him in. Blair stepped in, her eyes soft, but there was an edge to her. She had her hand on the doorframe, and there was something in her posture that made him feel like he was about to be told something important. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice low as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "Something that might change your mind." Benny's stomach churned with a mixture of dread and curiosity.
He didn't know whether to trust her or to bolt. But if he was going to be part of this fight, whatever it was, he needed to know what was at stake. Blair turned and motioned for Benny to follow her. "Come on. It's time you saw what Victor is really after." They walked in silence down a narrow hallway, Blair leading the way. Benny followed, his heart pounding, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his chest. As they reached a steel door at the end of the hall, Blair hesitated, then turned to him. "Once you see this, there's no turning back." Benny swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm already in too deep. Just show me." Blair nodded and opened the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with large crates and strange equipment. At the far end of the room, a series of glass containers lined the walls, each holding a figure inside, pale, lifeless, and unmoving. Benny's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer to one of the glass tanks and looked inside. The figure was human. At least it once had been human. Its skin was an unnatural shade of pale, and its eyes were closed as though in eternal sleep. What is this?" Benny asked, his voice hoarse. Blair's face was grim. "You've been using humans as blood bags, but not just any humans. These are the children of the Peacekeepers, your father's people. He's been capturing them, draining them, turning them into slaves." Benny's legs almost gave way beneath him as the reality of what Blair was showing him sunk in. His father had fought for peace, for justice, and now the very people his father had worked to protect were coming for him. "You see now, don't you?" Blair said quietly, her voice tinged with anger. "Victor isn't just after power. He's after the bloodline. He wants to wipe out everything your father worked for and turn this world into a battleground, a world where the only thing that matters is who's stronger." Benny turned away from the glass tanks, his mind reeling. His father's legacy was being desecrated before his eyes. The people who had fought to protect the world from chaos were being reduced to nothing. Benny's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm going to stop him." Blair gave him a sharp look, almost as if she hadn't expected him to say that, but there was something in his tone that made her believe him. "You're ready, then?" "I'm ready," Benny said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this."
The world outside felt distant as Benny stood in front of the glass tanks. The images of the captive bodies haunted his every thought, like a lingering nightmare that wouldn't let him wake up. These were people, real, living people, once part of a larger, peaceful world. Now they were reduced to nothing but victims, part of Victor's grotesque plan to erase the peace his father had fought so hard to maintain. Blair stood beside him, her eyes on the tanks, but there was no pity in her expression, only the hard, cold resolve that had become a part of her since the night she was turned. Benny could see the flicker of pain in her eyes, but it was fleeting. She had long since buried her emotions beneath layers of survival instinct. For a moment, Benny stood still, trying to make sense of the chaos. It was overwhelming, the sheer weight of it. But something inside him had shifted, something deep that told him this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future, a fight for everything his father had stood for. "What's the plan?" Benny asked, his voice hoarse. It felt strange asking the question. He was still trying to wrap his head around everything, but he knew he couldn't sit on the sidelines any longer. This fight, this war, had come to him, whether he liked it or not. Blair's expression didn't change. Victor's going to make his move soon. He'll come for the leaders of the peacekeeping factions, those who still hold the power to stop him. But first, he'll make sure to isolate the weak ones. He'll pick them off one by one, and if we don't stop him, we'll have nothing left.
Benny nodded slowly. And where do we fit in all of this? What's my part? Blair met his gaze, her eyes sharp. You're the key, Benny. The bloodline. It's more than just a symbol. Your father's people are scattered, but they're still here. We'll need to unite them before Victor's armies do. If we don't, he'll have the power to wipe out everything in his path. The word unite hit Benny like a cold wave. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't anyone who could rally others into battle. He didn't even know how to fight, let alone command an army of vampires and hunters. He was just a guy who had been thrown into this by chance. But there was something else, something inside him that told him this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future, a fight for everything his father had stood for. "What's the plan?" Benny muttered, almost to himself. "I'm not like you. I don't know how to fight. I don't know what to do." Blair stepped closer, her eyes softening for a moment. "You don't have to be like me. You just have to be yourself. Your father didn't fight with anger. He fought with purpose, with heart." Benny's breath caught in his throat. "But I'm not him. I don't have what it takes." Blair's voice grew quiet, but there was an intensity in her words. "You're wrong. Your father didn't have all the answers either. He just believed that there could be peace, that we didn't have to live in fear. And so do you. That's why you're the key." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours. Benny felt the weight of her words. There was truth in them, truth that resonated deep in his chest. He had spent his whole life avoiding conflict, running from the shadows that crept into his world. But now, he had no choice. Benny exhaled sharply, clenching his fists. "Okay, let's do it. Let's stop Victor." Blair's eyes flashed with something almost like relief, but it was quickly replaced by that cold determination again. "Good. But we have no time to waste. We need to move." The next few hours passed in a blur of action. Benny had no time to process everything. All he could do was keep up. Blair led him through the maze of the building, organizing a group of vampires and hunters who were loyal to his father's cause. They were the remnants of the old world, the last of the peacekeepers, and they were ready to fight. Benny had never seen anything like it. The room was filled with people who had once lived in the shadows, who had seen the worst of the world, yet they were driven by something more than just survival. They were driven by a sense of duty, of responsibility to protect the world they had sworn to defend. Blair stood in the center, organizing the group. She was a natural leader, calm, collected, and ruthless when she needed to be. But Benny couldn't help but notice how the others looked at her. There was a sense of respect in their eyes, but also something more, something unspoken. As Benny watched her work, he realized how much he still didn't understand. Blair wasn't just a vampire. She wasn't just someone who had been turned and cast into this nightmare. She was someone who had survived, and she had learned how to lead, how to fight. And he was starting to see that she wasn't just fighting for the peace his father had built. She was fighting for herself, too. But there was something else in the air, the sense of tension, of uncertainty. No one was sure what Victor's next move would be, but everyone knew that it was coming. And when it did, they had to be ready. Hours later, Benny found himself standing in the middle of a street, the wind blowing cold against his face. He wasn't sure how they'd gotten here or what had happened in the interim. All he knew was that they had to act fast before Victor's forces descended on the city. It felt surreal. He was just a guy from the suburbs, but now he was caught in a battle for the future of both humans and vampires. Blair stood beside him, her hand resting on the hilt of a sword. She was ready. Her eyes were calm, focused. "Are you sure about this?" Benny asked, his voice thick with doubt. She didn't look at him. She was scanning the streets, watching for any sign of movement. You've made your choice. We don't turn back now. Benny glanced at her. I'm not backing out. I never thought I'd be here, you know. I never thought I'd be part of something like this. Blair finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something flickering behind her eyes, something softer. None of us did, Benny, but this is where we are. And now, we fight. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Benny's pulse quickened as a black Maserati sped down the street toward them. He didn't need to be told who was driving it. Victor. Blair's hand moved swiftly, pulling Benny behind her as they ducked into the shadows. The Maserati screeched to a halt, its headlights illuminating the empty street. Benny's heart pounded in his chest as he saw Victor emerge from the car, his eyes glinting with malice. "You're too late," Victor said, his voice cold and taunting. "The game has already begun." Blair stepped forward, her expression hardening. "You think you can win this war, Victor? You think you can tear everything down and start at scratch?" Victor smirked, his gaze flicking over at Benny. "The boy. You brought him into this. How amusing." Benny stood his ground, despite the fear gnawing at him. He wasn't going to let Victor intimidate him any longer. He was done running, done being afraid. "I'm not afraid of you," Benny said, his voice steady. Victor raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "That's cute, but we both know what's coming. You can't stop me. You're just a human." Blair's hand tightened around the hilt of the sword, and without warning, she lunged towards Victor.
The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that only comes before the storm. Victor's mocking smirk still lingered in Benny's mind as the vampire lord stood before them, exuding an aura of raw power and contempt. Benny wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe the maniacal laugh, the endless threats, but the sheer coldness of Victor's presence took him aback. This wasn't some rogue vampire seeking chaos. This was a calculated, ruthless being, hell-bent on tearing apart the world Benny had once known. Blair stepped forward, her movements quick and fluid. She had always been poised, but now there was something in her eyes, something that hinted at a deeper fire. She wasn't just fighting for the peace his father had fought for. She was fighting for herself, for the future she wanted to build, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Victor stood with his arms crossed, an air of amusement curling around him as he watched them. "You think you can stop me, Blair? You've always been a pawn in this game, and now you're playing with the wrong pieces." Blair's eyes darkened. "You never understood what it meant to be human, Victor. You never understood what it means to fight for something other than power. That's why you'll lose." Victor's lips curled into a sneer. "I don't need to understand. I have everything. I don't need feelings or a legacy." Benny's pulse quickened, his eyes darting between Blair and Victor. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't prepared for a battle like this. He was just a regular guy caught in the web of their conflict. But now, in the face of this vampire war, he was more than just an innocent bystander. This was his fight too, and whether he liked it or not, he was tied to it. Blair glanced at Benny, and for a moment something softened in her eyes, a flicker of emotion that wasn't just cold calculation. "Stay behind me," she whispered. "We have to keep him distracted." Benny nodded, though his stomach churned with dread. He didn't know how to fight, how to defend himself against a creature like Victor, but he had to try. He had no choice. Blair lunged, her blade flashing in the dim light, but Victor was faster. With a flick of his wrist, he grabbed her by the arm, twisting it painfully. Blair hissed, but didn't back down. The sound of metal against flesh filled the air as she kicked him back, her boot connecting with his chest. Victor staggered but recovered almost instantly, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you can defeat me, Blair? You're nothing but a shadow of your old self. You're weak." Blair barely registered his words, her focus entirely on the fight. She was fluid, swift, every movement honed by years of survival. She swung the blade at Victor, aiming for his neck, but Victor was already moving, faster than Benny could process. In an instant, the fight became a blur of movement, metal clashing against vampire speed. Benny was frozen, watching them with wide eyes. The strength of their battle made him feel small, powerless. But something inside him stirred. He wasn't helpless. Not anymore. If Blair was going to fight, if she was going to put herself on the line, then he had to do his part. He didn't know what it was yet, but he had to find a way to contribute. He glanced at the shadows around them, his mind racing. There had to be something, anything that could tip the scales in their favor. And then he saw it. A rusted pipe, lying discarded on the ground near the edge of the alley. Benny didn't think. He just acted. His legs carried him over to it, his hands grabbing it without hesitation. The cold metal was heavy, unyielding, but it was better than nothing. With his heart pounding in his chest, Benny swung the pipe at Victor's back. It connected with a sickening thud, but it barely seemed to faze him. Victor whipped around, his eyes flashing with fury. "You dare!" Before he could finish the sentence, Blair lunged at him again, her sword coming down in a precise arc. Victor blocked it with ease, but Benny didn't stop. He swung again, harder this time, aiming for Victor's side. The vampire's gaze snapped at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something. Surprise? Annoyance? It was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold rage that Benny had come to associate with Victor. "You are the reason everything will burn, human," he snarled. His eyes flicked to Blair, his lips curling into a menacing smile. "But you're not strong enough. Neither are you." Before Benny could react, Victor snapped his fingers and the world warped. A blur of movement, a wave of force, hit Benny in the chest, sending him crashing backwards into the cold concrete. His vision swam, his body aching as he struggled to push himself back onto his feet. The pipe lay discarded, useless. Blair had been knocked back too, but she was already up, her eyes filled with resolute. Victor, unfazed, stood tall, the smirk never leaving his face. "Pathetic. The two of you think you can stop me? You can't even touch me." Benny's vision was starting to clear, but his head was spinning. The pain was overwhelming, and for a moment, he doubted himself. Maybe he was out of his depth. Maybe he didn't belong here, fighting against creatures that were beyond human comprehension. But then he saw Blair. She was standing tall, her sword in her hand, and there was fire in her eyes. She didn't give up. She never had. And as much as Victor was a threat, as much as he could destroy everything Benny loved, Benny couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. Victor laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "Do you honestly think this is enough? You're not the hero, Benny. You're just a human in over his head." But Benny, despite the ache in his chest, the weight of doubt that gnawed at him, took a deep breath, and for the first time something within him clicked. He wasn't just fighting for the world. He was fighting for his father's legacy, for the chance to prove that humans weren't powerless, that they could stand up against the darkness. "I'm not afraid of you," Benny said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Victor's smirk faltered for a split second before he shifted into a low growl. "You should be." But Benny was done being afraid. This wasn't just about survival. This was about fighting for something bigger, for something that had been lost. Blair looked at Benny, a flicker of approval crossing her features, before she turned back to Victor, ready to engage once more. The battle was far from over, but Benny knew that this was his moment, his purpose. The first step had been taken.
The world had narrowed into a single, breathless moment, the sounds of battle and the pounding of Benny's heart filling his senses. He could barely process what had just happened. One second he was on the ground, the next he was standing, blood pumping fiercely in his veins, the pipe in his hands heavier than before. His limbs were aching, his muscles screaming at him, but the fire inside him had been lit. Victor was still there, but his expression had shifted. No longer was he simply toying with them. There was a cold, calculating menace in his eyes now, a sense of danger so palpable it felt as if the air itself was charged with electricity. Blair's sword gleamed in the dim light, but her breathing was heavy, her movements slower. Victor's supernatural strength had taken its toll on her, and Benny could see it, the brief flash of vulnerability in her eyes. Despite the power she wielded, she was still only human at her core, a being who had been forced to live in a world that was never meant for her. Victor took a step forward, his lips curling into a malicious grin. "You still don't understand, do you, Blair? This world is mine for the taking, all of it, every last inch of it, and there's nothing you or anyone can do to stop it." His words hung in the air, the venom of them seeping into Benny's bones. This wasn't just about power. This was about control, about erasing everything in his path. Victor wasn't just seeking dominance over the vampires. He was seeking it over the entire world, a world where peace no longer had a place, a world that Benny, for all his doubts, had to believe in. Blair gritted her teeth, her eyes locked onto Victor. She wasn't backing down. "You're wrong, Victor. You can't have it all. Not this time." The sound of her voice, fierce and resolute, brought Benny back to himself. He could feel the fire inside him, the weight of their words. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the world itself. This was a battle for the future. But Benny couldn't shake the question that lingered in his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if he wasn't enough? Victor's eyes flicked to Benny, the amusement returning to his expression. "And you, human, what do you think you're going to do? You've barely touched me. You don't have the strength for this fight." Then he tightened his grip on the pipe, his mind racing. What could he do? What should he do? Then something shifted in him, like a switch had been flipped. For a moment, the fear, the self-doubt, all of it fell away. Benny wasn't just some bystander anymore. He was a part of this fight. His father's legacy wasn't just some distant memory. It was something he had to protect, something he had to fight for. Benny clenched his teeth and stepped forward. "I might be human, but I'm not going to stand by while you destroy everything." Victor chuckled darkly. "You think you're the hero in this story? You're just an insect, a pawn." But Benny didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady, "but even pawns can change the game." Blair was watching him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Benny to finally realize what he was capable of. She had always been fighting for something larger than herself, and now Benny was too. He had to be. Victor let out a sharp laugh, and before Benny could react, he lunged at them, his speed faster than Benny could process. The blade of his claws was a blur, cutting through the air with a terrifying precision. Blair moved to intercept, but she was slow, tired from the battle that had already raged. Benny's eyes went wide as he watched Victor's claws swing toward her, the deadly strike aimed at her chest. There was no way Blair could dodge it in time. Without thinking, he threw himself into the path of the strike. The pain was immediate, excruciating. A searing heat shot through his side as Victor's claw raked across him. He screamed in agony, the world tilting sideways, but he didn't let go of the pipe. Blair screamed his name, but it sounded distant, like she was calling to him from another world. Her voice, full of panic, seemed to pierce through the haze of pain clouding his mind. Victor stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You really thought you could stop me," he sneered, watching Benny stagger, a human trying to play a role that's never meant for you. Benny couldn't speak. His vision was fading in and out, his body collapsing under the weight of the wound. The world felt muffled, as if he were submerged underwater, but through the blurriness he saw Blair, her eyes wide with desperation. "You're going to die, Benny," Victor taunted, his voice cutting through the haze. "You're just another victim." But Benny wasn't done.
He couldn't be, not when everything was on the line. With every ounce of strength he had left, he forced his body to move. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He wasn't just fighting for his father's legacy. He was fighting for the world that still had a chance if they could stop Victor. Blair reached him just in time, her hand pulling him to his feet. Her grip was strong, unwavering. "Stay with me," she said, her voice trembling, but her eyes filled with determination. Victor took a step back, his eyes flicking to Benny and then to Blair. "You're both fools. You think you can change anything? You can't stop what's coming." Benny's breath was ragged. His body was barely standing, but something in his heart had clicked. Something that told him this was their only chance. This was the moment. He wasn't going to let it slip by. With a growl, Victor lunged at them once more, but this time, Benny was ready. He swung the pipe, his body moving instinctively, as if every part of him had been preparing for this moment. The blow connected with Victor's face with a sickening crunch. Victor howled in pain, staggering back, his face bleeding from the impact. For a moment, he seemed stunned. That brief flicker of vulnerability, Benny had seen it before, and now it was their chance. Blair, seizing the opportunity, surged forward. Her sword flashed through the air, cutting toward Victor's heart. Victor roared, trying to block the strike, but it was too late. The sword sunk deep into his chest with a sickening sound. His eyes widened in disbelief as his body froze. For a moment, he looked almost human, as if he could finally comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. Then, with a final, agonizing screech, Victor fell to the ground, his body disintegrating into ash before their eyes. The world fell into a heavy silence. Benny could barely stand, his blood spilling onto the cold concrete, but he had done it. They had done it. Victor was dead. Blair stood over him, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She looked down at Benny, her expression unreadable. There was no joy in this victory, no celebration, just a quiet understanding that this was only one battle in a war that was far from over. Benny staggered, his vision blurring once more. His body was on the verge of shutting down. But as he collapsed into Blair's arms, his final thought was this: it was worth it.
The city was eerily quiet in the aftermath of Victor's death. The usual hum of the streets, the distant buzz of traffic, the faint murmur of life carrying on. Everything seemed suspended in time, like a breath held too long, waiting to exhale. Benny lay on the cold concrete, barely conscious, the weight of his wounds pulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. But even in the darkness, the world outside didn't stop. The city didn't wait. The war had shifted. Victor was gone, but the battles were far from over. His death had been a signal, the first domino to fall in a much larger game. And no matter how hard they fought, how much blood was spilled, there was no escaping the storm that was coming. Blair, ever the survivor, had already moved. As soon as she confirmed Victor's demise, her focus snapped back to the present. There was no time for mourning, no time to rest. The peacekeepers were regrouping, but Victor had started something bigger than he could have ever imagined. And Blair knew they had to act fast before his vision became reality. Benny stirred, his body aching, but his mind too foggy to make sense of where he was. His breaths came in shallow bursts, his ribs aching with every movement, and there was a strange wetness on his hands. Blood. His blood. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "Blair," he rasped, his voice weak. She was there instantly, her figure a shadow in the dim light. She knelt beside him, her eyes scanning his injuries with the practiced ease of someone who had seen too much bloodshed. Her face softened as she gently placed a hand on his chest, her fingers brushing against his skin.
"You're still alive," she said, almost in disbelief, her voice quiet. It was hard for Benny to tell if she was relieved or disappointed. Benny managed a faint smile, his vision still blurry. He murmured, his words slurring together. "What happened? Did we win?" Blair didn't smile. "Victor's dead, but this isn't over. There's more at stake now than ever before." Benny winced as she helped him sit up, the world spinning slightly as he tried to find his bearings. "More?" he asked, confusion settling over him. I thought killing him was the end. We can finally rest." Blair shook her head. Victor was just the start. He had plans, Benny. Big plans. And killing him didn't stop what he started. It just made things more complicated. The other factions will be looking to claim power now, and there's no guarantee they'll play by the same rules. The peace is fragile, and it could shatter at any moment. Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Benny had been so focused on Victor, so fixated on taking him down, that he hadn't thought about the aftermath. What would come next? What had Victor's death unleashed? Blair helped Benny to his feet, her grip strong and steady despite the exhaustion in her own body. She had a nurse to watch after Benny. "We have to gather the others, form alliances, strength in numbers. If we don't, the entire city could fall apart, and it won't just be vampires and humans fighting anymore. It'll be chaos." Benny nodded slowly, his body still shaking from the blood loss, but he could feel the weight of her words. There was no going back. They had crossed a line, and they couldn't walk away from it now. The world had changed in an instant, and they were caught in the middle of it, like pawns on a chessboard. Blair's expression softened as she helped Benny to a nearby car, one of the few vehicles left untouched after the fight. "I know this is hard, but you're not alone in this, Benny. You've done more than anyone could have asked for. You've proven yourself. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Benny looked at her, his vision clearing just enough to make out the determination in her eyes. He had thought he was a spectator in this war, a bystander in a world far too dark for him to ever be a part of. But now he knew. He was a part of it, whether he liked it or not, and there was no way out. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice full of resolve, though it was laced with exhaustion. "So what's next?" Blair's gaze never wavered as she climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. "We find the other leaders, we gather support, and we prepare for what's coming. The city is on the brink of collapse, and the peacekeepers need a voice. We can't let Victor's death be the catalyst for total destruction." The drive to the safe house was slow as Blair maneuvered the car through the dark, abandoned streets. Benny was silent, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about Victor's death, about his own near demise, and about the future. Victor wanted chaos. He wanted the peacekeepers to tear each other apart, to ignite the war that would give him ultimate power. But now that Victor was gone, Benny couldn't help but wonder if the world was already too far gone. Was there any hope for peace left? Blair seemed to read his thoughts without him speaking. She glanced over at him as they turned onto a quieter street, her eyes unreadable. "I know you're thinking about what happens next, but we have to believe in the possibility of peace. If we don't, then we're no better than the monsters we fight." Benny's throat tightened as her words sunk in. He hadn't thought about it that way before. He had been so focused on surviving, on the immediate threat, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the bigger picture. But Blair was right. If they didn't believe in the possibility of peace, if they didn't fight for it, then what was it all for? "Do you really believe we can stop it?" Benny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stop all of this?" Blair didn't answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the road, but Benny could feel the weight of her thoughts. She had been fighting for so long, fighting for a world that didn't exist yet, a world that she wasn't even sure was possible. "I do," she said finally, her voice steady. "But it's not just about stopping the war, Benny. It's about rebuilding what was lost. It's about proving that there's something worth saving in this world."
They arrived at the safe house a few moments later, an unassuming building in a quiet part of town, hidden behind a veil of secrecy. Inside, a group of survivors were already waiting. Vampires and humans alike. Some were injured, others were just exhausted from the long days of constant fighting. But there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense of purpose that Benny hadn't felt before. Blair stepped out of the car, and Benny followed her. As they entered the building, Benny was struck by the quiet determination in the room. There was a palpable sense of urgency, but also something more. Hope. It was fragile, like a candle in the wind, but it was there. Blair turned to Benny as they entered the room, her eyes meeting his. "This is our next step. We build alliances. We form a united front." Benny looked around at the faces staring back at him. These were the people who had survived Victor's reign, the ones who had fought for the peace his father had started. They had lost so much, but they were still here, still standing. And for the first time in a long while, Benny felt like he wasn't fighting this war alone. As the days turned into weeks, the alliances grew. Benny and Blair worked tirelessly, rallying the leaders of the different factions, finding common ground between vampires and humans, and preparing for the war that was yet to come. But despite the constant pressure, Benny felt a strange sense of purpose building inside him. The fear and doubt had been replaced with resolve. He had found something worth fighting for. One evening, as Benny and Blair stood on the balcony of the safe house, watching the city below, Benny turned to her. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked quietly. Blair looked at him, her gaze softening. "Every day, but I don't think about it in terms of what we've lost. I think about what we can still build, what we can still protect." Benny nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "We've come a long way, but there's still a long road ahead." Blair gave him a small, weary smile. "There always is. But we don't stop. We keep going." And as Benny stood there, looking out at the city they had fought for, he knew that no matter what came next, he wouldn't face it alone. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over, and they were ready. The dawn of a new world was still uncertain, but it was a world they were determined to fight for.